So we're getting to the halfway point of this year's program, firmly in the middle of things. The session coming up is called Real Time. Design relies on the power of observation. Observation improves with distance. We can look deep into the past or far into the future and see problems and possibilities with clarity. It is much more difficult to respond to the world unfolding all around us right now, in all its closeness, contingency, and complexity. We are, as of this moment, ensnared in an entangled reality of climate crisis, global pandemic, and social inequality. And all of our actions are mediated by technological interfaces so advanced that they may as well be magic. But respond we must. We cannot stand by passively and watch our future become the past. We need to find the tolerance, the tools, and to interrogate the infrastructure and ideologies of the present moment. Technology will get us out of this mess. Technology has created this mess. Technology is what we make it. Welcome to Real Time. Our next speaker is the Australian-born, New York-based artist and environmental engineer, Tega Brain, Assistant Professor of Integrated Digital Media at New York University. Tega is a translator and a storyteller. She delves into the inner workings of machine learning algorithms, extractive industries, and tech company logic, creating poetic projects that explain and offer alternatives to present-day systems. So through Tega's work, we learn more about the sometimes bizarre, sometimes terrifying consequences of a world fueled by abstract data. We see the accumulated reality of all New York real estate, a teetering pyramid of inflated capital, and visit post-natural landscapes cultivated and sustained by AI. Today, Tega will share two recent projects that attempt to realign the virtual realm with its physical, all too real consequences. Following her presentation, she will be joined in conversation by Living Cities Forum creative advisor, David Neustein. Welcome, Tega.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Yes, I'm very sad that I can't actually be with you all in person today, and my heart really does go out to everybody in Australia who's in lockdown. I've been living and working from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people for the last few years, and this is a place now referred to as Brooklyn, New York. So I want to acknowledge and pay respects to Indigenous elders past, present and future who have stewarded this land. Thank you for the intro, David. As you've said, I'm originally from Sydney, from Gadigal land, and my work examines issues of ecology, how our ecological entanglements are perceived, understood and imagined, and how this sort of ecological thought or imagination shapes our technologies and our systems of infrastructure. My work examines what is seen as success or failure in what we build, how this is decided and who gets to decide this. But I'm also concerned, with sort of the reverse. So how the design of our technologies opens up or forecloses ways of thinking and being. So, how do our technologies design us? As an artist, and a thinker and a writer, I use my practice to sort of animate and materialize questions of the hard to see norms and assumptions that are based into our technologies and to the imaginaries and myths that drive them. In my work, I ask questions about the systems we make, how they produce ways of acting, how we can intervene in the world. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in this work. And so as you'll see, my work often is like publicly probing, where we might have agency, how we might rethink or redesign or remake the world and the systems, in it. So I often call this type of work, this way of working, eccentric engineering, where I'm, often trying to build systems that decenter the human in how we design or engineer. Or I'm asking questions like, what would infrastructures look like that support, other forms of relations, mutualism, for example, maybe mutualism between humans who are seeking to wash their clothes in a wetland that's also great at purifying water. And so this is what I'm attempting to do here in this work called Coin Operated Wetland. But I'm also really interested in inefficient interfaces and technologies. So what happens when things aren't optimized as we expect or in ways that we think we want? For example, this smell-based dating service, and this was an online service that connected people based on smell rather than any sort of visual or demographic information. Inefficient, but very moving. So by probing and exploring where conventional systems leak or fail or work in unoptimized or inefficient ways, we can often glimpse other ways of being in relation in the world. And so today, yes, I'm going to share two very new works that are exploring some of these questions in different ways, and that are specifically looking at issues of climate change, climate design, and potentially climate engineering. And so when I say climate engineering or even environmental engineering, images like this might spring to mind. So what do we see here? We see, feats of design and engineering. We see quantification, we see, like carbon accounting is implied. To zoom in a bit, we see projects such as like massive tree planting or impressive large-scale speculative, and now emphasize the word speculative machines like artificial trees that are attempting to draw down carbon. Even though most of these things are, in the very kind of early R&D phase. More controversially, you might spot, interventions like solar engineering, which is attempting to sort of manage solar radiation entering the atmosphere. But what we see here are stories of engineering at scale, grand schemes to, save the planet, if you like. And I'm really interested in these proposals and in these this area of research. As researcher Holly Jean Buck argues in her book called After Climate Engineering, we are so deep into the climate emergency that we do need to grapple with how we are going to better manage the carbon cycle. So there is no shying away from this challenge that is ahead of us. But I also invite you to consider what's absent in this image. First of all, we don't see any people, right? So there's this sort of suggestion that somehow there's still this kind of separation between, the humans and environment. Engineering and design involves, is sort of shown here as this one-way process of acting on the world. The landscape is sort of presented in this neat, tidy backdrop, visually implying that kind of things are under control, that we can sculpt the world or optimize it to our own will. We don't see any indications of like emissions reductions or lifestyle changes or, even how we've gotten to this stage of climate breakdown. We see a story of science rather than a story of corruption, deception, willful negligence, murderous negligence, we might say, where industries and politicians have and are still failing to act in our best interests and the interests of the biosphere. And so the two works I want to share today sort of contend with some of this. They try to reframe the climate crisis and climate action and the management of the carbon cycle in different ways. And the first does this by understanding climate not as a problem of science, but rather as a problem of narrative. So yesterday, Manhattan looked like this, covered in a blanket of smoke that stretched the entire North American continent, all the way from the massive West Coast wildfires that are now burning. And I know you all know like what that feels like, after living through the Australian fires of 2019 and 2020. So we are definitely witnessing what Australian climate scientist Joelle Gerges calls the great unraveling, what could be described without exaggeration as, the most significant event in human history. And yet, climate change still fails to regularly make headlines or front page news. This graph was widely shared on social media today, showing, a comparison of how much time was spent covering Jeff Bezos's, flight into space compared to how much time was spent covering climate in 2020 on one of the broadcast TV channels in the US. Shocking, right? And so the business model of the media and the internet mean that many news outlets rely on revenue by selling ads that run alongside stories. The more traffic a story receives, the more money it earns. And then there's this incentive created to optimize news coverage and journalistic endeavors for views and clicks, signals that are assumed to indicate the online crowd, the digital gathering, the appearance of human engagement. So engagement data is determining how stories are aggregated, shared, promoted, what's getting covered. And sometimes there isn't even a human in the loop, right? So URL pings, page requests, mouse clicks, all this engagement data determines the value of reporting and its sort of visibility online. But should issues, existential issues like climate, be contingent on such signals? And should action be contingent on these sort of inscrutable algorithmic systems? And these are really the questions being explored in this project, Synthetic Messenger, just recently launched. It's a collaboration between myself and my longtime co-conspirator, Sam Levine. And it's probing this algorithmic media landscape. It's a work that takes the form of a botnet. A bot is an algorithmic process. It's programmed to automatically, generally this is, how a bot is sort of understood, right? It's these algorithms programmed to carry out online activities, such as generating text and posting it to social media, or clicking on content, or listening to keywords or hashtags and automatically reposting content. So basically, bots are used to sort of simulate human interactions with online platforms. And a botnet, is a large number of these algorithmic processes sort of running together at scale. And so our botnet, the one we built in this project, is programmed with the goal of artificially inflating climate news. So every day our system searches the internet for recent news coverage of the climate crisis, and then it feeds the URLs of these articles it finds to 100 bots that then, over time, visit all the articles and click all the ads running alongside them. So we're driving traffic to climate reporting, and in doing so, potentially amplifying and making this content more visible and more lucrative to media outlets by generating advertising revenue. So Synthetic Messenger, in this project, we are leveraging this behavior, the behavior, of how the media is driven by engagement data and its automation. We're leveraging this through this other automated system. So essentially, our bots are talking to their automation or their bots, right? We've got bots talking to bots. And in doing so, we're trying to draw more attention to the climate crisis and sort of curate attention in different ways. And also reveal the way that algorithmic logics are changing the production and consumption of media and reporting. So as you can see, our bots were sort of unusual in that they're animating their activities. This is not how a bot typically would work, but we did a call out to our community who donated hands and voices, and so every bot had a sort of own personality. And these could be experienced in the context of a Zoom call. And so the work sort of takes the form of this algorithmic performance running over a number of days or weeks, where one can sort of join the call and commune with these
Scroll, click,
click,
scroll, click,
Scroll, click, scroll, click,
scroll, click,
Click.
scroll,
Scroll.
click,
Click.
scroll,
scroll,
click,
Scroll.
scroll,
Scroll.
click,
Scroll. Click.
scroll,
Scroll.
scroll,
accompanying this sort of performance, the website for the project, so the project is an online project, shows the stats and activities of the botnet. So it ran for 2 weeks, recently launching in the STRP festival in the Netherlands. And in this time, it visited over 2 million sites and clicked over 6 million ads. And so the website is showing the live data and the actions of the botnet. And so, of course, the media is this crucial space for translating scientific findings, for holding corporate and government actors accountable, and for producing political pressure for action. And in all these capacities, it's therefore a critical space for determining the future state of the atmosphere. And the fossil fuel industry has known this for a long time. So through use of lobbyists and enjoying the unwavering support of figures like Rupert Murdoch, you know, the fossil fuel industry has worked to control the climate narrative via the media. They know that those who control the media cycle have an outsized capacity to influence the carbon cycle. And so this is sort of our representation of this in the image you see on your screen. So this is not news. Industry-backed media manipulation strategies are well documented and include, you know, there's a whole host of them: undermining scientific credibility, promoting and funding inaccurate research, downplaying risks, promoting false uncertainty. And all of this has produced what climate futurist Alex Steffen refers to as predatory delay in our climate response. Strategies also include quite sophisticated techniques like framing narrative. And, you know, on the screen, you see a screenshot from BP's, the first carbon footprint calculator made in 2004. And so this was, you know, funded by the oil company BP to really kick off the framing of climate response on an individual level, right? So that we are all to individually reduce our carbon footprint as a way of just deflecting attention and responsibility away from industry. So, you know, here we still haven't held industry accountable for this. And, you know, there are also an evolving catalogue of media manipulation strategies that leverage algorithmic and economic logics of online platforms. And so the use of media trolls and bots for amplification of misinformation is common, and such as this example that happened during the Australian fires in 2019-2020, where, you know, there was this sort of emergent narrative online that the fires were attributed to arsonists to sort of deflect from the fact that we were witnessing a sort of climate breakdown event. And so, you know, amplification happened through, you know, hashtags, automated posting, retweeting of this arson narrative. Now, you know, all automated posting or programming bot-like activity, you know, it's actually a regular and everyday PR activity now. You know, in the context of COVID, you know, you might see a hospital that's making an automated post every day of their COVID stats. So not all bot activity is nefarious. Sometimes it is useful messaging. So it's not so simplistic that, you know, automation is to blame here. But it is absolutely the case that, you know, automation is being used to spread and amplify climate misinformation, like in this example. And this remains a genuine challenge, especially in a media ecosystem that remains very sympathetic to climate deniers and fossil fuel lobbyists. So, you know, the pandemic has demonstrated many things. And one of them is that platforms like Twitter are really willing to moderate user content and misinformation with warnings, such as the one you see on screen being placed under posts that are maybe spreading vaccine misinformation. However, Twitter and Facebook refuse to moderate climate misinformation, a stance that essentially does make them platforms of climate denial and deception. As climate writer Emily Atkin argues, the climate story, again, is no longer one about science, but it is a story of injustice, corruption, and deception, and it always has been. In her words, climate change is the result of a 40-year campaign to lie and prioritize short-term profit over the health of vulnerable people. Our actions and inactions have distinct atmospheric effects. The news we see and the narratives that shape the news we see and the narratives that we hear and believe shape our beliefs. And this directly shapes the climate. So synthetic messenger serves as this provocation to see media itself as a form of climate engineering, a space where narrative becomes ecology. And so the second work I'm going to share today is called Solar Protocol. It's a little bit of a change of direction here. And this is a work that responds also to the climate emergency and the questions of how we design in response. And a common thing we see is that we need more data, more accurate modeling tools. There's this sort of drive to build better models and produce these computational tools in order to make better decisions. However, Solar Protocol attempts a reframing of this. It is trying to articulate an alternative way of making decisions about the environment, and it seeks to recognize more than just human intelligence and more than artificial intelligence, and is exploring what we are calling natural intelligence. And this project is a collaborative work. It is a collaboration with Benedetta Piantella, who is a technologist and designer, and Alex Nathanson, who is a specialist in solar-powered art and has just put a book out on solar-powered art practices. And of course, we are also working in collaboration with a lot of volunteers around the world who are helping us make this work. This work all started in 2018 when I came across this website by Low Tech magazine, who had redesigned their entire archive and site, setting it up to be hosted on a solar-powered server. So a solar server is a small single board computer. You can use something like a Raspberry Pi, and it's powered by a solar panel and a battery. So it's not reliant on grid electricity, although it is reliant on, the internet, right? Because it is a server and one accesses it via the internet. But due to this sort of reduced power situation, Low Tech magazine had to make a whole lot of different design decisions, right? So you see the images are monochromatic, they're dithered, because they try to reduce the size of all the assets on their site to reduce the computational work required to serve them and reduce the energy demand. You can see that on the site, there's information about the battery level. So that yellow section is showing you the battery level at any time. Also the conditions at the site of the server. So we see all this information about the server and its situation that typically is totally masked by the cloud. And I just, was so inspired by this work because it is such a powerful reminder that despite us calling it the cloud, planetary computing is a massive resource-intensive endeavor that demands eye-watering quantities of fresh water, energy, mining, exploitative labor practices, and so forth in order to exist. The other profound thing I think to notice here is you'll see that the subheading on the site says this is a site that will sometimes go offline, because of course a property of renewable energy is that it's intermittent. So renewables like solar and wind are obviously environmentally contingent, and thus, there's this inconsistency that's quite at odds with the sort of expectations and culture that we've developed around, fossil fuel or extraction-based energy. So the project contains this really interesting question for me, which is like, what does low carbon culture look like? What opportunities do we have to explore aesthetics and expression and so forth if we are driven by a different set of design parameters that might come from renewables or low carbon practices? And so we set out to start messing around with solar powered computing, putting together our own version of a solar server. And through doing this, came across the idea or developed the idea of connecting all of these servers up to try to create a solar powered network. Could the configuration of a computer network, computers are great joined together, could this mean that the website could maybe be less intermittent? Or could we create a website that is then served from wherever there might be the most sunshine in that network? And so that was the beginning of the Solar Protocol project. It's an experimental computational network that's made up of a series of solar-powered servers, each set up in a different time zone and weather system around the world. And the servers collectively host the project website, serving it from whichever location is in the most sunshine. And so in this way, the work explores a logic and an automation that comes from the environment itself. So the routing logic and where your traffic is sent is determined by the sun. Each server is stewarded by volunteers in different locations. And so this is where we currently have servers set up, with the dotted lines indicating the ones that are where installation is in progress. So we have one in Newcastle, Australia, which is probably visible to you now. And we have one coming online in Alice Springs soon. And so this work playfully reconfigures what's known as the Domain Network Service Protocol, or the DNS protocol. So DNS is this decentralized system that essentially associates URL to IP address. So, when you ask for solarprotocol.net, your browser is sent to the DNS server, the IP address is sent back, and then that IP address directs you to wherever the website is hosted across the internet. And so for large-scale, high-volume web services, you can imagine like Google, the DNS protocol is typically set up to direct traffic to whichever server gives the quickest response time, because of course Google has data centers and servers, everywhere. So whichever server pings back fastest is likely, that's probably where your web traffic is being sent. And so this is the logic of the internet, right? Where speed is prioritized over all other factors that determine how a network operates, a characteristic that's really prevalent in digital culture. But it doesn't have to work this way. So in Solar Protocol, our network is built with this different logic. Each of our servers checks in with each other, and the server that's generating the most solar energy at the time becomes the active server and sends its IP address, sets it up with the DNS server. And so that means when someone visits the website and their browser asks for the site, their request is then sent to that active server that's in the most sunshine. So we're sort of playing with the DNS protocol in this way. And so in our network, decisions about where to move computational activity then happen according to where there's the most naturally available energy, rather than according to what was going to give you the quickest results for the user. So we've sort of shifted away from this user-centered logic to a environmentally centered logic. In other words, in Solar Protocol, the distribution of sunshine and therefore energy around the planet determines that DNS configuration, or that path between client and server. And so, here, each individual server only offers intermittent connectivity, but when connected as a network, and the more servers that join the network, the more capacity the system has, and the more it's able to distribute its activities according to sunshine. And so in this way, the decisions here are automated by a kind of natural rather than artificial intelligence. So if we think about, how do we define intelligence? Well, one way of thinking about it is it's this capacity to synthesize knowledge and synthesize knowledge as logic, and then apply that logic to make decisions. And so in Solar Protocol, the intelligence sort of emerges from earthly dynamics and emerges from that sun-earth interaction. And so the project raises this question of what gets to be recognized as logic and therefore applied as intelligence. So we've heard a lot about artificial intelligence over the last few years, where logics come from massive data sets that are statistically analyzed for pattern and correlation. But what of logics that might be applied and what of other logics that might be applied and understood as intelligence? What of intelligence that might neither be artificial nor human, that which we are provocatively calling natural intelligence? And I know the term natural is fraught. We're not using it to sort of return to some kind of modernist fantasy that, separates the humans out from everything else. But it's a provocation, and we're using it to disturb that dualism that's already in that word artificial, right? Artificial implies a sort of separateness. And this is not just a linguistic thing, but it's strategic. The term artificial, obscures the exploitation of human labor and human intelligence that's central in what we call AI today. And, Amazon's cynically titled service called Mechanical Turk reminds us of this. They're referring to historic example of the automaton, where there's a grand chess master hidden in a machine and it looks like the machine is playing chess. And so, how do we recognize that there are more diverse forms of intelligence and logic in the world, and how do we learn to work with these in design and in infrastructure? It's also easy to overlook that these sorts of automations exist outside of the human. Multi-species entanglements, relationality, these are all part of what we call wilderness, or part of what we call an environment that exists without us humans. So reproductive cycles, vegetative metabolism, automated material cycling, all of these things happen in an automated way in the environment without human intervention. And like all infrastructures, natural intelligence becomes most visible in its degradation. And this can be seen in the ecological crises we are witnessing, where we're seeing this sort of unraveling of automation, as species interactions break down or climate interactions break down. And so it's really urgent, I think, that we learn how to recognize design with natural intelligence. And perhaps this is a useful thing about AI and working with AI. As theorist Benjamin Bratton has asked, does AI offer us this Copernican turn as a way to recognize that we don't have a monopoly on intelligence or automation, and that it sort of exists more broadly in the world and outside of us and outside of the human? And, this could be one of AI's sort of most valuable effects. We also took inspiration from a project by artist Joanna Moll called Hidden Life of the Amazon User. And in this project, she audits and records the eye-watering amount of computational work that is required by her browser when she goes to Amazon and buys Jeff Bezos's books called The Life and Lessons and Rules for Success. And she shows, as her browser is doing all this work, is that Amazon is expert at capitalist logic, right? That incentivizes the exporting of costs to someone else, somewhere else, right? And we see this in the way that Amazon outsources its costs to the state, where many of its workers are forced to use social services like food assistance because they're not paid enough. And then we also see this in how their website is designed, where they're outsourcing costs to the user. So when you buy something, you're paying for that computational work through your electricity costs. And yet this computational work is producing a lot of value for Amazon, right? So they're on-selling your data, they're using it to, make predictions about what book you'd like to buy next. And so it's very valuable. And so there's this sort of outsourcing at play. And in contrast, in Solar Protocol, we attempt to be accountable for this way that, computational work is material. We generate all the visualizations server-side, so we're not using like a JavaScript, which runs in the browser, because, the browser might be fossil fuel energy, we don't know, but we do know our servers are solar powered. So we're trying to think about, like, as designers, what are the implications of the decisions we're making? And this visualization that is up on screen is showing the sort of activity across the network. So each ring is a server, and the yellow is indicating sunshine levels, and the lines are showing which is the active server. So you can see that, when the sun comes up in different areas, it sort of moves to that active server. And so, I return to this question: what does low carbon culture look like? Does it look like being accountable for one's design decisions? Does it look like perhaps stopping work if your server runs out of energy and going and doing something else? And this is what happened to us, in the middle of the New York winter when we were working on this, and the batteries would run out of power. We'd call it a day, right? And so thinking about how design designs, right? Technologies are also designing us as future humans and our future behaviors and our relationships to work and rest and sleep and all of these different things as well. Finally, the work also is really inspired by Indigenous scholar and plant scientist Robin Wall Kimmerer. who has examined this and written a lot about this idea of the honourable harvest. And so this is an Indigenous protocol. It exists in lots of different formats and permutations across North America. And it is, and as she describes, the honourable harvest describes practices and philosophies that guide the manner in which we take from the living world, protocols of asking permission, evaluating impact, taking only what you need, using appropriate technology, demonstrating respect, and reciprocating the gift. And some of these rules include, like, never take the first plant that you see, or never take more than half, both of which are deceptively sophisticated species management protocols, ensuring that you firstly are never going to take the last member of the species, and secondly, that you don't overharvest a region so that it can regenerate. And so this idea of the protocol to manage an environment is something that I think is very powerful. And renewable energy production takes a step towards this kind of more honourable environmental ethic, right? In Solar Protocol, we have a system that's governed by a protocol that, curtails its operations based on the available energy that it's able to produce itself. And the work, also really pushes back on the imagination for computing. The foundational idea in the field of computer science is this idea of the Turing machine, where you have this machine that can sort of record data on this infinite roll of tape, right? And so this idea of the infinite roll of tape has produced this imagination that computing is unlimited and that it is infinite. I think we readily forget that there is no such thing as an infinite roll of tape. If we look at projects such as this project from the EU called Digital Twin, where they're trying to develop, a perfect virtual simulation of the world in order to better make policy decisions, using extreme scale computing and real-time exploitation of all available environmental data, you can see that this imagination and this sort of ideal of infinite computing really persists and is being touted as the sort of, response to the climate crisis. But I ask you, like, is it a lack of data or a lack of computing that is really the problem here? And there's a few examples on this slide of, 1857, a little known scientist, Eunice Foote, pointing out that CO2 is warming. She says an atmosphere of this gas would give our Earth a high temperature. Limits to growth in 1970s, about pollution. And then, 2017, over 15,000 scientists signed the Warning to Humanity a Second Notice, detailing our climate peril and the need for rapid and radical transformation. And this is the most signed document in human history, right? So it's not a lack of information. It's not a lack of knowing what is happening that is the bottleneck here or is the disconnect. And rather, I think this sort of pursuit of data and computation is often a big procrastination strategy for predatory delay, where we put off action rather than changing ourselves and changing the ways we're living. So Solar Protocol hints at this sort of model for algorithmic governance or automation that comes directly from climate dynamics themselves. Rather than automating decision-making with AI or massive amounts of data or machine learning, can we automate it by paying attention to the environment and by recognizing that there is intelligence and ways to make decisions outside of the human? These ways also avoid, abstraction or simulation, which, come with a certain politics and certain challenges. And so as an effect, it also sort of removes this impetus to wait for ever higher resolution models and more correct data and more accurate data with larger computers. It asks, how might we use the climate itself as guide and organizing principle? How can we design with at-work intelligence of the environment right here and right now? Thank you.
Tega, that was so dense, just absolutely a kind of waterfall of issues and information and questions that I'm now trying to unpack in my head. I guess the first question, the one that I have, and I should also just say that at the moment we're talking now, I'm in a pretend office in my home in daytime Sydney. You are in your actual office in nighttime New York. Thanks so much for joining us, for joining us out of hours to make this possible. My first question really is one of amazement, and the question is, how do you really, with these projects that when we see them, they're packaged in this way, which has a very strong narrative and a very clearly presented response to some very complicated issues. How do you start developing a project? So when you were in terms of developing synthetic messenger or solar protocol, where do those projects come from? How do you build them, and how do you build them into a clear narrative and a clear performance of the idea?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of different things that happen in making these projects. They often respond, well, I think and we can see two different approaches in either one, right? So sometimes I make work in response to sort of things I'm seeing in the world that I feel like something is missing, right? And so the discussion around geoengineering and climate response, it always feels like the human piece is missing, or that there's still this sort of like separation between human culture and it as ecology, right? It having an ecological impact and effect, and it being ecological. And so then I'm like trying to think of ways to sort of reframe that. And so thinking about, like things that are very human, like telling stories, or, the news, or working another piece about sleep at the moment. So like thinking about how these things are sort of also places where we make decisions and where we are living in certain ways, but they are also open for negotiation and change. So yes, often it's a response to this sort of like dominant narrative that I feel annoyed by, or that I feel like, I want to see it shift. And Solar Protocol, a little bit of the same, right? So that project was really a coming together of many things. I was messing around with a lot of solar experiments with computing, and just thinking about how one could run your internet or your phone, or like, again, these devices and technologies that seem like they are separate from, the material world. How can you run them in a different way? And then, then that was sort of collided in that project with trying to think about automation and artificial intelligence differently, right? So, all of those in design and architecture will be fully aware of how dominant, that discussion around like what is the role of automation and AI in our work, whether you're working in architecture, design, art, it's touching everything. And yet, it's so narrow. It's such a narrow way of viewing the world, right? It relies on large amounts of data. It relies on their statistical analysis. It's a very unhuman way of seeing and knowing. And yet we're putting so much weight on it, right? So, what other ways are there? There's a lot of other ways that we automate, or the things are automated. Yeah.
Who are in devising a project, and in terms of these particular two projects as well, you and your collaborators, Sam Levine and the other people that you work with on your projects, are individual actors coming together to produce projects, and you're talking about, you're sort of in dialogue, or you're in opposition to enormous forces and companies. We talked about Amazon or BP or the Murdoch media empire. Who who do you think of as your audience for these sorts of projects? Who are you trying to reach with these projects?
They definitely work in different registers. So, I work as an educator, so a lot of this thinking also comes out of ways of teaching design and ways of teaching technology. And I think artistic engagements with these things, like the playfulness, the ability to sort of pay attention to failure, and the freedom you kind of have for experimentation, is really critical for developing a critical perspective of them. So there's definitely the audience of my community and being part of a sort of ongoing conversation. But then they always also tend to break out of that and stimulate conversations more widely, right? So the Synthetic Messenger project provoked, we had a lot of emails from climate organizations and groups saying, can we use this? Is this a way we should be amplifying our work? And this is something we're considering and we're talking to these people about. Is this something that could be shared and experimented with further? And then on the other hand, the sort of more Silicon Valley response to this was it's completely, it's click fraud, and you're going to get the news outlets kicked off the ad networks, and the bot activity will be detected. And so very concerned that it sort of pushed against the logic of these systems, and then it sort of breaks them or transgresses how they're supposed to be used. And also legitimate concerns, we don't know the effects of synthetic messenger, right? Because these systems are really black box, so it's really hard to understand if you had an impact or not. But part of the project is sort of talking about that and coming to terms with that. But they're definitely projects about discourse, right? About how do we think and talk and understand these issues differently.
I wanted to ask about the DNS server response of Solar Protocol. And you were talking about the normal way that the system's designed so that we just get the fastest possible response. That was making me think about things like how, so much of the stock market speculation now happens in these millisecond gaps, where if you're closer to your proximity to a server, your proximity will actually influence how quickly you can jump on a stock as it escalates or something like that. What's the sort of delay time at the moment with this imperfect network you've set up, at the small scale that exists, that you're subject to by using the solar cell that's in the sun at that time?
Look, I can't give you exact speed data, but because the site is really tiny, it's actually been surprisingly fast in terms of responsiveness, right? Because we're not doing JavaScript data collection, we're not doing Google Analytics, we're not running any kind of heavy computational process. It's a static page generator. So that means that on the server, all the pages are generated periodically and then just sent out as plain HTML. So it makes it surprisingly fast because, this is how websites were designed in the 90s, right? And everyone thought, the internet's going to be so fast. But actually, we have sort of really clogged up our media just with really heavy media, heavy virtual type of experiences. So it was surprising for that reason.
Yesterday I was reading in the papers, there's current debate going on in Australia through the continual uptake of renewable energy, which apparently at some points of peak is providing the dominant energy source now, and whether we should be charging solar providers, household or small scale solar providers, to when they send energy back to the grid at times when it's not demanded. And there's sort of various points that I can't attempt to summarize all the points of debate there, but the big takeaway from reading about that yesterday was actually that there's an amazing reversal going on, where instead of local, households or, local communities needing to draw energy from big providers, from these, from large scale infrastructure, that they're actually the producers, and they're now giving energy back to the grid and back to the collective. So they've become, it's in a weird way, it's become like, the sorts of early form, the agricultural society that existed before, the industrial age, where people could basically manage their own production. I think that solar server is so interesting in that context because it may be another one of these abstract sort of techno-utopias, but that does suggest a level of control that people might have over their energy demands, a level of cooperation they might have with others. And it's interesting to see the tensions at the moment between allowing people to be their own producers and manage their sort of power relations between themselves, and the demand to fit in with an infrastructure that's much more abstract, and it's about sort of consolidating and divvying up power supply.
Yeah, it is a big challenge. This is something that's also happening in California, right? Where, you have certain moments where the grid is really overloaded with renewable energy, but then you do have moments where you really need fossil fuel energy, like nighttime, winters, these types of moments. So it's not a simple process by any means to make the energy transition that we need to make. And I'm definitely not teaching grid managers anything new here, right? But I think the story you're telling too also just demonstrates that there is a willingness, there is a desire, a willingness, and an urgency felt by most people on these issues. And the problem really is, our political class. But I think, I think there's also, the sort of different logic that comes as if we are to move out of a sort of extraction-based economy and mode of production. And often that looks very foreign, and often that looks like inefficiency, right? Renewables look really inefficient and problematic when you're comparing them to like fossil fuel energy in the very short term, but over, if we look at actually a climate scale time scale, then obviously they don't.
I mean, what I find so appealing about solar protocol as a narrative, as an idea, as a ethics, I guess. When COVID started to impact around the world and we had to change what our lifestyles, our daily habits, it's obviously caused a whole lot of stress. But for many of us, I guess for those of us who are more insulated or privileged, there was also this kind of possibility, this hope that we could start to sort of surrender or give up some of the demands of our daily existence that seem to just speed up all the time, this instantaneity that's expected of all of us, and the kind of this possibility then that maybe things could slow down a little bit and give us back some sort of connection with the world around us, or let us or reduce the expectations of our productivity. And I think that what's really interesting about solar protocol in that context is that even most of the narratives around renewable energy, electric vehicles, as you showed in that wonderful sort of tableau, these kind of new carbon economy solutions to sustaining human existence, as the climate collapses around us, there's still this complete logic of production and extraction, and we're looking at the effects of lithium and what's required to kind of build this infrastructure that's supposed to sustain us. We're just going to replace, there's a high chance that we're just going to replace one really problematic regime for another, and still be where we are, which is basically taking too much from the planet that it can that it can actually support. I think what the beauty of solar protocol is that there's an implied, whether or not we know the effects and whether we can adjust them or not, there's an implied inefficiency, there's an implied sort of surrender or relaxing of expectations because we're supporting a higher order, which is an environmental order. And I think that's what's really hopeful. I think that for me is what needs to be inserted into this dialogue about changing energy systems and paradigms, where we actually also recognise that there's no complete substitute for the way we live now, that the way we live now is actually not in itself sustainable.
Yeah, right, that we need system transformation, but also transformation of, our sort of cultural ideals, our what we see as productivity, or like what we see as what it means to be like a contributing member of society. Like, I think all of that needs to shift. But it's hard stuff. Like, that's a profound transformation that needs to happen. I equally felt the same in the early days of the pandemic, where, granted, very privileged, kept my job and wasn't dealing with the economic hardship that many were and still are. But there was this sense that, there was this sort of like world of possibility that had opened up for living in a new way, right? Paying attention to the local environment. I mean, I know every inch of my local park now, and like prior to the pandemic, I barely went in it. And, I didn't leave our neighborhood almost for, 9 to 10 months because we were locked down for a long time last year. So there was this real shift in attention and register and how one is living, that I also am very worried that there's this big push by all the institutions that I'm a part of, and to just put things back where they were and continue on. And I think a lot of us really hoped that this would be a turning point for us all and for dealing with the climate emergency. And hope, like I hope that it still can be. But yes, I'm seeing the same things you are, in that there seems to be this huge sort of inertia to just put things back.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I just want just a follow-up question in terms of the way that you were talking about the JavaScript and the sort of the reliance on energy intensive processes that underpin this information realm that we exist within. Do you think that there's a possibility then of having a kind of branding, like sustainably sourced technology? Is that possible? Could we choose to use products that have demonstrated that they're dealing with this sort of extractive process in a more benign way?
That is a great question. I mean, I maybe. One of my favorite projects that I think is since sort of been retired was a project called the Dumb Phone Store, and it was a response to the Apple Store, but it was full of apps that you could run on a dumb phone, right? So run on like an old, $20 Nokia. Because what do you really miss when you using an old piece of technology like that? You don't really miss the social media and all that. Like, you could do that elsewhere, but you miss the maps. And so the two creators of the Dumb Phone Store, Alison Birch and Ramsey Nasser, that was their argument. And so then they sort of made this open source project that invited people to create applications that could run on that sort of technology. And, the most popular one was the maps one, right? And it sort of was a text-based map, so you could like ask for directions and it would help you. But I just found that project so inspiring because it did, open up this possibility of, again, this idea of progress, this idea that, the iPhone 75 is better than the iPhone 74. I mean, this is just a marketing ploy that we're all a part of. And that there could be other, I mean, of course, yes, we are stuck in a sort of ecology of software, and like that project was actually massively technically challenging because it's not easy to do that stuff. So yes, there is this inertia that is unavoidable, right? Where I can't really go back, but you could, like these systems are malleable. We have designed them. Yes, there's lots of layers and they're all interlocked and it's hard, but it doesn't have to be the configuration that we're in right now. And I think that's also something that I'm trying to like push at with my work, is that to point to that fact that a lot of this stuff is malleable and arbitrary and is come out of these sort of like layers of people working on it over decades and decades.
I mean, I think that's the other big takeaway for me. You have a book that you've recently published with Golan Levin on code as a creative medium. You have as a background as an engineer, have become an artist. And I think in that process, you've also become, over time, increasingly computationally literate, from what I understand. And I think that what's really interesting to me as a designer is this sort of substance that's all around me, that conditions the environment I work in, is something you've chosen to intervene in, which requires this sort of constant real-time updated knowledge to understand the systems that we're using. But you're also trying to educate others in how to read and write those sorts of logics and protocols and understand their basis, their source code, what abstractions they rely upon. I think it's really interesting. It suggests potentially that code is really the kind of the key medium for design today, given the way the world's constructed.
Yeah, it has been incremental for me, that sort of drift into computation. I owe a lot, I think, to the open source, computing arts, computing community. There's a lot of tools that, I'm sure many people in the audience use, right? Such as processing P5, open frameworks, like these tools made by artists for artists really have lowered the sort of barrier to entry to learning and playing, experimenting, the sort of work I'm talking about, playing with these tools and media. And so, I really I think just, the arts and the humanities, the digital humanities similarly, is engaging with these technologies. I really think we can't overemphasize how important and what a huge contribution that has been made to understanding them, but also like critical perspectives on them, demonstrating ways that they work, ways that they break, like what ways, like seeing the world with a computer, what it leaves out. There's such a rich amount of like creative work that has really progressed those discussions. And so I think it's just a plug for supporting the arts there. But so that my book project that actually I think came out in Australia like a day or two ago.
Wow, okay.
Just got an Australian release. Yes, so it's called Code as a Creative Medium, and it's basically a handbook for teaching and learning how to make art and design with computation and with code.
Well, I can see in my screen, I can see that my shadow has now appeared on the wall behind me, which tells me the light's changed, and I've probably taken up enough of your evening time. That was really inspiring. Thank you so much, Tega, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really, really wonderful to be here.